Hello, my name is Dale, and I'm going to be telling you a bit about the British East India Company and how it brought India under British rule. Around the year 1600, Queen Elizabeth I signs a charter granting the British East India Company authority to set up trade in the East Indies, which is what we know now as Indonesia. The goal of the company was to trade iron and wool for the rare spices that were only found in the East Indies back then. Their trade route took them south around Africa and across the Indian Ocean into the East Indies. And when they arrived in the East Indies, they soon found that other European nations had already established trade with all the locals of the East Indies. France, Portugal, Spain had basically beaten them to the punch, and by the time Britain shows up in the East Indies, the locals weren't as interested in what Britain brought to trade, not as much as the East India Company was hoping for. And eventually the British East India Company gets cramped out of the spice market there, and they get forced to move and find somewhere new to trade. And what ends up happening is in about 1640, the East India Company strikes a deal in India that gets them a plot of land where they get to set up a little settlement. They get to set up a colony kind of on the south part of India. And what they find there is an even more demanding market for their steel, for their wool, for their iron. And there in southern India, they're able to get a much more profitable amount of spices by trading with those guys. Much more profitable than what they were getting in the cramped market of the East Indies. And while they're there, they also find opportunities to trade for fine textiles, silk, and stuff that the merchants of the Indian subcontinent have. And these spices and silks that the company trades for, they're able to bring it back to Britain. And those spices and silks were incredibly valuable in Europe since they were only found there in the Far East. They're able to make a ton of profit with this little trade situation they had there in India. And as the East India Company grew, it established more settlements and more colonies all throughout India. And when the company had their charter signed in the very beginning, they were given authority from the Queen to wage war and conquer whatever they need to. And they use this as they're spreading throughout India, but not always. They don't always have to use force because they are a business, they are a company. They're able to find ways to set up agreements with the local leaders. Many of the local leaders were able to find profitable business setups with the British, and many of the local leaders there in India willingly submitted themselves to British rule as their rulers started to fall out. As the Mughal Empire starts to decline, about in the 1700s, as the 1700s go on, the Mughal Empire is kind of on its way out, and many of the local leaders were kind of looking for something like the alliance that they were able to find with Britain. And that's why we see in the 1700s the British colonies are spreading all over India, and by the 1850s, basically all of India has come under British rule, whether by becoming allies or by being conquered or whatever it be. It's about the 1850s that you see Britain really has full control of India. And it's about 1857, there in the mid-1800s, you start seeing some of the last little remnants of the Mughal Empire start organizing rebellions and start fighting back against India, against the company, against the East India Company. And the company's gotten so big and so widespread at this point that they have no trouble suppressing these rebellions. But what does end up happening is these rebellions lead the East India Company to give up its control of India and transfer power to the British Crown so that the British Empire has official control of India. And this is how what starts as just a little trade venture, as a company going out to make some money, leads to the conquering of an entire subcontinent. And we see that these merchants, seeking to only make profit, bring in millions of subjects to the British Empire. Not just bringing in the money and bringing in the silks and the spices, but also bringing in subjects for the crown. And it's all of these resources combined that gives Britain what it needs to fuel the Industrial Revolution that starts in the late 1800s. The Industrial Revolution that kind of sets up Britain as one of the big world powers going into World War I, going into the 1900s, and this is how we see that these dealings of this one company, the East India Company, forever defining the destinies of both Britain and India, setting up both of those nations to be where they are today. And these are some of the sources that I use to kind of gather info on the British East India Company. Those last two YouTube videos were pretty interesting to watch and pretty well made, and yeah, that's the British East India Company.